What is Asperger's? Asperger's and high-functioning autism. The Diagnostic Statistics Manual, or DSM-5, no longer uses the term Asperger's. Now all the autism diagnoses fit under the umbrella of Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD. Asperger's is now called high-functioning autism, or HFA for short. Many people who embrace their diagnosis prefer Asperger's, and so do we here at AspergerHelp.com. You may even hear some people refer to themselves as Aspies, and we respect that. We will call them people. The first thing you need to know about people with Asperger's or any person on the autism spectrum is that each person is unique. It's like fingerprints. No two people with Asperger's are the same, and every person with Asperger's has a unique set of challenges and talents. The saying in the autism community is, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. That's why having Asperger's will be as unique to you or your child as your fingerprints are. Some people with Asperger's will share some characteristics, experiences, and may even think a lot alike, but Asperger's will still be different for each of them. Some people with Asperger's talk a lot, and some don't. Some people with Asperger's love science and math, and some are horrible at those subjects. Some people with Asperger's are really into computers, and others love sports. There is no stereotypical way to have Asperger's because everybody gets a different blend of how it affects them. The more you know about Asperger's, the more you'll be able to understand it. The Asperger Help website is here to help and assist you and provide support as you manage your diagnosis or the diagnosis of someone you love. I invite you to dive into our community. 3 aspects of Asperger's. Because autism spectrum disorder is so different for each person who has it, lots of people get confused about what autism is. Autism is a neurological disorder that affects behavior, communication, and socialization. This is why the word spectrum is so important. People with autism can range from someone who has an intellectual disability or low IQ to a person whose IQ is genius level, with all possibilities in between. How someone is able to take care of themselves and be a part of society is called functioning. People with autism can be low functioning, having trouble with dressing themselves, getting along with others, speaking, and generally being independent. Other people are high functioning, able to be self-reliant and adapt to many different challenges. With the spectrum, people with autism can fall anywhere on that scale. Some people who have a high IQ can still be low functioning and nonverbal. They would not be diagnosed with Asperger's. Asperger's is the high functioning end of the spectrum. Many people with Asperger's have an average to genius level IQ. They are verbal, which means they communicate by speaking. It's hard to imagine how such a variety of people can have the same diagnosis and be affected so differently. But what is common about autism are the areas affected, and those areas are behavior, socialization, and communication. It is the intersection of the 3 areas that defines autism. If someone struggles with behavior and communication, but not socialization, they don't have autism or Asperger's. All 3 areas must be present for an autism diagnosis. I think it's interesting that each of those 3 areas can have an overflow or lack. In communication, an overflow or excess would be talking too much. You find this a lot in Asperger's. A lack or deficit happens when someone is nonverbal, which is more of a classic autism symptom and not Asperger's. Both talking too much or not talking at all fall into the communication category. We just make distinctions based on excesses or deficits, overflow or lack. In the following lessons, I'll tell you more about behavior, socialization, and communication. Here at AspergerHelp.com, we give you the tools to help manage your diagnosis. Listen to the next lessons to learn more about behavior, socialization, and communication. Behavior. The first area of the Asperger's diagnosis we'll look at is behavior. People with Asperger's almost always have an area of interest or hobby that they love and cannot get enough of. Whether it is playing video games, learning about airplanes, or collecting maps, these interests go far beyond just being a hobby. So this behavior would be in the excess column. This area of interest is kind of like an obsession, really. People with Asperger's love to talk about their interest, spend lots of time planning for it, and then spend even more time seeking it out. Another behavior excess is stimming, which is slang for a self-stimulating activity. Sometimes this is hand flapping or rocking or some kind of physical movement that might look like a tick. Stimming can feel soothing, but it isn't always socially appropriate. Neurotypical is a word we use for people who don't have autism or Asperger's. You may have to think about replacing your favorite stim with something that looks more like something neurotypical people do. For instance, if rocking back and forth is your stim, you might want to replace that with something like jiggling your legs or your foot. Meltdowns would also end up in the excess column of behavior and are also very common for folks with Asperger's. Asperger Help has some specific suggestions for managing them, so be sure to check out those solutions. Meltdowns come from sensory overload, too much stress, or just too much of everything. Feeling overwhelmed brings a huge emotional response, which can result in crying or screaming. One kind of deficit or lack in behavior is a slower rate of emotional growth. Nothing is wrong with how quickly or slowly you mature, but it can be hard to manage when you are in school. For some reason, the brain of a person with Asperger's grows differently than a person who doesn't have autism. One thing I find interesting is that kids with Asperger's tend to grow faster in the cognitive area, which is that part of the brain that learns. They can zoom ahead of their peers and classmates in school, but they can lag behind when it comes to emotional maturity. What this ends up looking like is that an Asperger kid will have an emotional growth rate that is about 2/3 of their age. It's not a bad thing, but it can be a hard thing. Adults often see a smart kid with Asperger's and expect them to act more grown up than their peers when they are not even capable of being age appropriate. To be honest, middle school is a tough age for just about everyone. But when an Asperger kid goes to middle school around age 12, their body is going through adolescent changes just like their peer group. But emotionally, they may feel like an 8-year-old. Their classmates may be thinking about the opposite sex and becoming more independent, where the kid with Asperger's just may want to play Minecraft. This different way of maturing can make socialization really tough. It's not bad, just not the same as their peers. And that can create some hard situations. In the next lesson, we'll talk more about socialization. AspergerHelp.com is a welcoming and safe place for you. We understand your challenges and we accept you. Socialization. In a world where people are encouraged to be individuals and are told that it's okay to stand out in the crowd, it's pretty amazing how important it is for all of us to feel like we fit in. Autism acceptance is a growing movement, and perhaps someday society will treat differences with more kindness. Until then, it is important for people with Asperger's to learn how to deal with neurotypical folks. One mother of a child with Asperger's tells her kid, "I think you should get to be who you are. There's nothing wrong with Asperger's, but then again, you are vastly outnumbered. You need to learn how to get along with neurotypicals because they may not bother to get along with you." These different behaviors, which are not bad, just not typical among peers, can create difficulties in socialization. Human beings long to spend time with each other, even if it's only for brief periods of time. Understanding others and being understood is part of the human experience. Socialization is another category of overflow and lack, excesses, and deficits. Socialization is not something children are taught in school because it's one of those things that most kids seem to learn naturally without too much help. But this is not the case for kids on the spectrum. Many kids with autism report feeling lonely. People with Asperger's have to study social cues and learn body language besides learning all the rules and expectations in any given situation. Asperger's doesn't allow for learning by osmosis or learning by doing. Socialization can be as hard to learn as algebra, but it can be learned. Just as you would need a teacher to explain the intricacies of solving an equation, an autism service provider can help you. That person can be an autism specialist, a behavioral therapist, a counselor, a teacher, or even videos on YouTube. Each social setting has its own unique sets of rules. We use the term hidden curriculum to describe social rules. The hidden curriculum is very different in every situation. For instance, yelling in the backyard is not how you talk inside at the dinner table. You can talk trash in the boys' locker room, but don't use that language in front of your grandmother. Women often socialize and talk to each other in their bathroom. But in the men's bathroom, you don't talk or even make eye contact. Laughing and telling jokes with your family at Thanksgiving is a great time to do that, but it is not acceptable at a family funeral. So many rules, and they can change from one situation to the next. Each new place and setting has its own rules, and most people with Asperger's have to learn them by being taught by a parent, teacher, or autism service provider. Neurotypicals seem to learn these unspoken rules without a problem. Asperger folk do not. In fact, a lot of hidden curriculum seems illogical and stupid to them, which can make them reluctant to practice those social rules. But these expectations become very important in the workplace. It is important to be able to get and keep a job, so you have to go along to get along. Problems with socialization that Asperger's may cause. Problems with personal space, like standing too close to others. Understanding body language. People may say something they don't really mean just to be polite, or they will use their body language to signal what they really mean. Reading facial expressions. It's not just the words people say, it's the expressions on their face. Understanding empathy and how to show it. It is a myth that people with autism do not have empathy. It can be hard to put yourself in the place of a neurotypical person who experiences the world very differently than you do. But people with Asperger's may also have to remind themselves to use their empathy skills. Making and keeping friends is hard. The way you make friends as you get older changes. You may struggle with overcoming disappointments with your friends. When there is an argument or a fight, you have to try to work through it, and this is a hard skill to learn. Conversations can be a problem for people with Asperger's too. Part of this is due to communication struggles. For instance, people with Asperger's can flood conversations. It becomes more of a monologue than a dialogue. In other words, the conversation is one-sided. The other person may leave just wishing that the guy with Asperger's would have taken a breath. Folks with Asperger's have to learn to leave some room in the conversation for other people to talk. Neurotypicals can lose interest during one-sided conversations, and they may avoid the person with Asperger's in the future. Another conversation struggle is that the person with Asperger's may love to talk about their hobby, that area of interest they are obsessed with. This can affect the natural flow of conversation. Their conversation partner might move on to one of their areas of interest, a movie they just saw, or how their work is going. Oftentimes, the person with Asperger's will turn the conversation back to their own favorite hobby instead of asking questions or talking about the new subject, and the neurotypicals don't typically like that. Other socialization issues involve safety. It's hard to follow the rule of don't talk to strangers when everyone seems like your friend. When it is okay to talk to a new person, finding the right kind of small talk is hard. Someone with Asperger's may ask questions just because they are really curious. Sometimes this is endearing, and other times it can appear rude. For instance, asking someone about their new baby is sweet. Saying that the mom looks pregnant is not so endearing. Learning how to talk about the weather and asking "how are you" are important skills to learn. At AspergerHelp.com, we understand the natural struggles Asperger's can create. We are here to provide support and hope for you. Consider us your community. Communication. Communication is more than just talking. We communicate in lots of ways. Obviously, words are part of that. But so are body language and facial expressions. We point, we gesture, and we listen. Communication has to be two ways. For folks with Asperger's, communication can be fantastic and terrible all at the same time. Most Asperger folk have an amazing vocabulary. Kids with Asperger's sound like little professors, spouting out words that are way above their grade level. On the other hand, summarizing, editing, and finding the main theme of a story is hard. If you ask a kid with Asperger's what the book they're reading is about, they will probably tell you the whole story and may even have it memorized word for word. No kidding. Everything seems important. Everything is the main theme. Reading comprehension can be difficult for kids with Asperger's since editing and summarizing are hard for them. In school, language arts can be a real mixed bag of grades. Vocabulary scores may be above grade level, while other scores like reading comprehension and summarizing are below. People with Asperger's tend to be long-winded and like to talk a lot. This is not a bad thing. Many people are just natural talkers. We say that they have the gift of gab. Asperger folk tend to dominate the conversation in ways that are uncomfortable for neurotypical people. It is important to learn how to have more give and take in the conversation, particularly in the workplace and school. This monologue kind of conversation is sometimes described as flooding the conversation because the other person doesn't get a chance to respond or contribute much except for listening. Since kids with Asperger's can speak intelligently and are often intellectually advanced for their age, adults will expect them to act older and behave like older kids. Adults may have difficulty understanding why children who speak like they need to skip a few grades are behaving like younger children, and for the same reason that the vocabulary is amazing. Instead of the adults having more patience with the kids' slower emotional growth rate, they may expect better than average behavior. Even though they can sound like they are speaking philosophically, most kids with Asperger's think very concretely and struggle with abstract thought. Sayings and idioms can be confusing to people with Asperger's. For instance, if you say, "Never look a gift horse in the mouth," you mean don't complain about something you get for free. Someone with Asperger's might imagine you looking at a horse's teeth. Or, if you use an idiom like, "off the top of my head," you mean you're thinking about something in the moment. A person with Asperger's might start staring at the top of your head to see what's coming off the top of it. Behavior, socialization, and communication. These are what people with Asperger's must work through and grow into. Here at AspergerHelp.com, we offer you a place to develop solutions. Sensory Processing Disorder definition. Sensory Processing Disorder, or SPD, is a common neurological condition that people with autism often have. Both autism and SPD are neurological disorders, but they are different kinds of neurological disorders. SPD is a separate disorder from autism, yet almost all children with autism have SPD. Sensory processing disorder affects the brain's ability to receive, understand, and respond to information that the body's senses send to it. It is possible to have SPD without having autism, so if you meet someone who has SPD, don't assume that they are autistic. Like autism, SPD is unique for each person, and each person gets a different mix of symptoms. The 5 senses that we think of most are touch, sight, hearing, taste, and smell. SPD doesn't mean that a person's senses don't work, although it's important to have them checked. Instead, SPD happens when there is a breakdown in communication between the body and the brain. This is what happens for a person who does not have SPD. They break their foot. The body sends a message to the brain that an injury has happened. Then the brain takes that information and processes it. Next, the brain sends pain messages to the body, which causes the injured person to be very careful with their injured foot. They won't be able to walk on it because it hurts too much. This keeps them from making the injury worse. With someone who has SPD, the message from the body to the brain may be slowed or may not get there at all. If this is the case, here is what the process would look like. They break their foot. The message that there is an injury reaches the brain. The brain misinterprets it. The person does not feel the pain or enough of the pain. They walk on the broken foot and further injure it more. Here's another example. You're standing in the freezing cold with only a short sleeve shirt on. Your body will send messages to the brain that it is cold. The brain receives the signal that the temperature is freezing and recognizes that it must warm up the body. Then the brain sends information to the body to shiver, which will help the body to warm up. With SPD, the body may send a message to the brain that doesn't get there or gets there too slowly. That situation might look like this. A faulty message of cold moves through to the brain. The brain recognizes the correct signal and sends the correct response. The message breaks down before reaching the body. The person in the situation does not feel the cold at all. They are at risk of freezing. Besides the 5 senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch, we have inner senses as well that help us to tell the difference between up and down, left and right, whether or not we feel dizzy, and how big our bubble of personal space is. These senses are called proprioceptive senses. I prefer saying inner senses. These senses are controlled by our inner ear, muscles and tendons, and several body parts that sense movement. So, with SPD, you can get 2 very different responses for the same reason. One child with SPD may be a thrill seeker, a daredevil kind of kid. People wonder why they take such chances, jumping off stairs that are just too high, going too fast on playground equipment. The brain, especially a child's developing brain, is asking for input. But a child with SPD that is having a communication breakdown on the way to the brain has a hard time feeding the brain information. So they play in risky ways that often result in them getting hurt. A kid with SPD where the brain gets the input but sends an exaggerated, over-the-top response looks like a timid kid who doesn't want to spin or swing. too much movement may make them sick. Both kids have SPD. In the next lesson, we'll talk more about the many ways SPD can affect children. AspergerHelp.com presents these lessons so that you can learn and understand more about Asperger's. We are your safe place and your community. SPD, the 5 senses. Sensory processing disorder doesn't mean that someone has something wrong with their eyes or their ears or that their senses are not working. But you definitely want to rule those things out. Get an eye exam and have your hearing and other senses checked. With SPD, the problem is with the body giving the correct signals, and also the problem is with the brain sending out the correct signals as well. What does that look like? Let's look at some examples. Touch. With the sense of touch, several different things can happen. A person may have one response or all of them. SPD is different for everybody. A person who has touch and feeling sensitivity may hate the feeling of light touch. It can even register as pain. As you are listening to me talk, pay close attention to your clothing. Can you feel the tags in your shirt? Is your waistline or belt tight or a little uncomfortable? What about your feet? Are your shoes snug around your heels? Or are your socks a little bunched up or nubby feeling? How about jewelry? Can you feel your earrings, necklace, or watch? Is anything itchy, tight, scratchy, or soft? A person with SPD may not be able to filter out all that sensory information. All that sensory input can be so distracting that someone lightly touching them is just too much. People who struggle with this kind of SPD tend to like tag-free clothing, sandals, soft materials, microfiber, and sweatpants. Even so, deep muscle pressure, like a bear hug, can help because it's soothing. Sometimes people will wrap themselves tightly in a blanket to create that sensation. It relieves them a lot. Weighted blankets or weighted vests can also help. Dr. Temple Grandin, a designer of livestock handling facilities and professor of animal science at Colorado State University, also has autism. She built a machine to help calm herself similar to the one that holds cattle. It creates that deep muscle pressure and helps her to reset. Sight. People with SPD who have a sensitivity to lights can struggle in different places. Fluorescent lights can be the worst. A good example of what it is like for them is when you see an old fluorescent bulb. It will flash and cycle in a way that puts you off. Most people can see this when it happens, but people with SPD can always see the fluorescent bulb cycling whether the bulb is old or not. This can become annoying, unbearable, especially in stores or other places that only have that kind of lighting. Natural light is better, and light bulbs that mimic natural light are the best to have in your home. Sometimes wearing colored glasses can help with light sensitivities. The cheapest thing to do is to go to the dollar store and try on different colors of sunglasses to find out which one works best for you. Hearing. Hearing challenges are also about having a filter that is too strong or isn't strong enough. Imagine what it would be like if every sound that you heard was the same volume. You need to listen to your boss or teacher talking while at the same volume you hear the clock ticking, footsteps in the hall, someone tapping a pencil, and a phone ringing. It might look like you weren't paying attention, but the truth is that you just couldn't hear the person talking over all that other noise. On the other hand, another person with SPD who could filter noise pretty well might take longer than normal to process all that information in the brain. It's like when your computer runs slower because you have so many tabs open and running at the same time. This might appear like they aren't listening, but really, they just need extra time to respond appropriately. Taste. You may think someone is just a picky eater, but if they have SPD, there's a lot more going on. People with a taste sensitivity can face some tough nutritional issues. Rice may feel like having sand in their mouth. Yuck! Nobody wants to eat sand even if it's good for them. Mashed potatoes are just fine though. Rice and potatoes aren't so far apart as taste goes, but the texture is way different. This heightened feeling of texture can lead to problems socially. People can get their feelings hurt when you don't like the food that they prepare. Picky eaters often struggle not just with texture, but also with the taste of foods. Imagine what food might taste like if your taste buds that detect bitterness are overactive. A lot of dishes that are okay for everyone else might taste like medicine to you. If sweets are the only thing that tastes good to you, you may want to eat a lot of candy and chocolate. People who have SPD that affects taste can struggle with trying new foods and eating healthy. Smell. By now, you may have already noticed that SPD is all about filters, too little or too much. Being sensitive to smells and odors can lead to some strong reactions. People with an increased sense of smell might notice offensive odors that no one else can detect. On the other hand, they may completely filter out more offensive odors that others do smell. SPD presents numerous challenges. Occupational therapy can be helpful in dealing with the most difficult symptoms. It takes time, effort, and concentration, but there are alternatives that can be helpful. AspergerHelp.com understands the issues you face, and we are here to help. SPD, the inner senses. Inner senses or proprioceptive senses. Proprioceptive sensation is an inner ear feeling of your body movement and where your body is positioned. It is controlled by the inner ear, muscles, tendons, and other soft tissue in the body. Your inner ear has canals that work kind of like a level. Your inner ear can tell up, down, left, and right. If you spin, the inner ear will send signals to the brain, and you'll recognize that you feel dizzy. Eventually, you will feel dizzy enough that you want to stop, unless you have SPD. If you do, you might never feel dizzy. When people struggle with their inner senses, they may appear clumsy. Sometimes they struggle to feel where their hands and feet are. They may walk like they are marching, picking their feet up high. People whose inner senses are overstimulated by the brain will get dizzy very easily and may get carsick a lot. Just a little bit of movement makes them queasy. Inner senses help people to feel where they are in relationship to others. We call that a personal bubble. Sometimes folks with SPD don't have one and become confused when other people get mad when they stand too close. SPD affects motor skills or the way people with SPD move around. They can have difficulty moving through the world without tripping or bumping into things. Their timing may be off, so catching a ball can be difficult. Fine motor skills are using small muscles like the ones found in the hand. Handwriting can be terrible, and cursive is the worst. Tying shoes can be really hard. Folks with this kind of SPD may be okay with grasping things and using their hands, but small, detail-oriented things like crafts may be too difficult. Sensory overload can create stress and anxiety, which is already a part of the Asperger experience. Often, overstimulated senses can lead to very real pain and even a meltdown. SPD is not something to be ashamed of. It is important to get the accommodations needed for work and for school. Occupational therapy, OT for short, is a therapy that helps children or adults to use their bodies as they are healing, or if they have a disability. OT can provide helpful ways to deal with mismatched sensory responses and difficult daily tasks. OT also helps with developing the filters needed to overcome sensory overload. If you can find comforting sensory experiences or tools like a weighted blanket, it is a good idea to have them on hand to help you through those difficult moments. AspergerHelp.com provides the kind of community experience that you may need as well. Connecting with others who face the same difficulties you do can help you to let go of some of those powerful emotions you may feel. Plug into our community to learn even more about Asperger's. Benefits of Asperger's. When you are told that you or your child has a disability, it can be difficult to imagine that the disability can create something good or maybe even something wonderful. But to be very honest, Asperger's has qualities about it that our society truly needs. This is the reason that many people believe that Asperger's is a learning difference rather than a disability, a thinking style. Famous people believed to have had Asperger's. It isn't possible to go back in time and diagnose these people, but historians have looked at several famous people, and judging by some of their behaviors, we believe that they had Asperger's. Here is a list of a few of them. Albert Einstein, physicist; Sir Isaac Newton, mathematician; Emily Dickinson, poet; Andy Warhol, artist; Isaac Asimov, Author, Charlie Chaplin, actor. Michelangelo, sculptor. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, composer. Thomas Jefferson, United States President who wrote the Constitution. Thomas Edison, inventor. Now here's a list of famous living people who have an Asperger's diagnosis. Daryl Hannah, actress. Tim Burton, filmmaker. Temple Grandin, livestock behaviorist and autism advocate. Susan Boyle, singer. Satoshi Tajiri, creator of Pokemon. Dan Aykroyd, actor. Not everyone who has Asperger's will become famous, but because Asperger's creates a one-of-a-kind way of viewing the world, it gives people that have it a helpful viewpoint. Perseveration. Have you ever seen someone who couldn't let an idea or situation go? No matter how much you try to change the subject, they would go right back to the issue that was bothering them. This is called perseveration, which is a symptom of Asperger's. When a person with Asperger's perseverates, they kind of get stuck in a loop. They can be obsessed with one thing and think and talk in circles. It can be an area of interest, but it can also be an upsetting event, a happy memory, almost anything. If the person with Asperger's can harness all of that energy found in perseveration to create something or to experiment or to work on computers, perseveration becomes a good thing. We don't know for sure that Thomas Edison had autism or Asperger's, but it is the subject of some good conversation. Whether or not he did, his never-quit attitude is why we enjoy electric light bulbs today. He conducted hundreds of experiments before he found a light bulb filament that would last a long time. This kind of dedication to a task is something people with Asperger's are great at. That is what perseveration can look like when you work with it. Innovation. Some people believe that Bill Gates, inventor of Microsoft, has Asperger's. While this has not been proven for certain, Bill Gates represents what someone with Asperger's can do with a single idea. Another person believed to have had Asperger's was Howard Hughes, who was a rich entrepreneur who was successful in the airline business. Hughes also displayed a mental illness later in life that led him to live a hermit's life. It is unfortunate that he didn't have access to the medications available now. That spark, that one thing that catches the attention of someone with Asperger's may be the catalyst of innovation that the world needs. Dr. Temple Grandin, who is an autism advocate and is diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder, loves animals. Her interest in cattle and invention has led her to breakthrough design changes for holding pens for large animals. Instead of square pens, Grandin creates round ones that mimic the natural movement of the animals. Imagination. Many people with Asperger's are artists, musicians, and writers. That difference that Asperger's creates can also be what makes a person with Asperger's look at the world of beauty and art in a whole new way. Using the area of interest as a career choice. The area of interest, the one thing that draws the attention of someone with Asperger's that is so much more than a hobby, sometimes can become a career. It is hard to imagine that a kid who wants nothing more than to play video games all day could use that as a career choice, but it happens. The most obvious choice is someone who creates games. However, video games are coded like everything else on a computer. Coding is an excellent career choice. Someone who plays video games a lot will have the opportunity to repair that gaming system, which could lead to a career in computer repair along with IT, another coveted career choice. If a kid likes airplanes, look at the variety of jobs involved with aeronautics. From working with a ticket counter to being a flight attendant, navigator, or even pilot. Numerous choices with different skill sets are needed in the airline industry, including mechanics. Having Asperger's doesn't mean someone is a genius or a savant, but most people with Asperger's are capable of leading self-supporting, meaningful lives. Getting past the barriers that hold them back is the key. This is why socialization skills are so very important and should be regarded as being as important as academics. If you are an amazing genius but you are unable to manage life with a world full of neurotypicals, that wonderful talent may never find a way to be put to good use. The world needs people with Asperger's. Temple Grandin once told a story during a conference about cavemen and women. She asserts that Asperger's and autism have been around for a long time. We just recognize what it is now. She made her point by saying that when there were cavemen and cavewomen, most of them would sit around the campfire socializing and talking about their day. But in the back of the cave, there were people with Asperger's trying to figure out how to make a better spear. Her illustration is kind of funny, but it is on point. Folks with Asperger's naturally try to create new ways of doing things. It's marvelous. AspergerHelp.com has many more learning modules for you to explore. Our online community will help you to find people like yourself, and I invite you to join us. Hope. At times, having Asperger's can be painful, and sometimes it just makes life hard. However, with intensive therapies and one-on-one interventions, children can work themselves off the autism spectrum. To be clear, autism has no cure. However, it is possible to overcome the symptoms of autism to the point that a person can no longer be diagnosed with it. Your brain would still be wired for Asperger's, but you would train your brain to behave in ways that makes diagnosing you impossible. We call that moving off the spectrum. Even if you don't move off the spectrum, you are a valuable human being. There is a reason why the human race needs people with Asperger's. Keep in mind that Asperger's comes with a lot of useful assets. The ability to stay on one task for a really long time is something that a lot of neurotypical people just can't manage. Remember the story of Thomas Edison and how he kept experimenting with different filaments for the light bulb? That stick-to-itiveness is what it takes to overcome difficulties. And that area of interest? Some Asperger folk find jobs in that very area of interest that they love. For parents, it is important to think of parenting your child with Asperger's with a long game strategy. Progress may be slow and take a while to gain momentum, but keep this in mind. People with Asperger's and autism often learn in the Gestalt method. That is to say that they learn in big chunks. A lot of neurotypical people learn in a linear fashion, in kind of a steady growth. People with Asperger's have to gather lots of information before it all suddenly makes sense to them. Don't get discouraged when you or your kid can memorize stuff without truly understanding it. That comes later, when enough information is gathered and the brain can suddenly make sense of it. One way to think of it is like a big computer. You type in the data and the computer can bring up the data, but it can't analyze the data. Suddenly though, it gets enough information, a new program download, and everything works right. You get equations and formats, all of it. This is how learning works for people with Asperger's. You put in information over and over, and then suddenly they have an aha moment where everything makes sense. All that memorized information can now be accessed and used, and they got it. Adults with Asperger's often become self-supporting taxpayers who live on their own. They live deeply rewarding lives. It can take some time for them to find their niche, but that's true for just about everyone. Society is beginning to embrace autism, so people with Asperger's are finding more acceptance every day. AspergerHelp.com is the place where you find that acceptance anytime you need it. We are here for you with the information you need and a culture of caring and support. And best of all, hope. Don't forget the hope.